They wrote the word dead on my bedroom door in bright red lipstick that was mine, the one I used to wear on Christmas when I wanted to feel festive. The same shade my husband once said made me look like I still had mischief in me. I remember standing in the narrow hallway, staring at those four letters, so crude and uneven, dripping slightly as though whoever scrawled them pressed too hard, not writing, but stabbing at the wood. I should have screamed. I should have wiped it away in fury. But instead, I reached out with my hand, touching the sticky letters, and thought only that it had been a long time since anyone had written anything with me in mind. I was alive, and yet I had been declared gone, and in that house the declaration felt final. Not a joke, not children's play, but a verdict whispered and agreed upon when I wasn't supposed to hear. I am 81 now, sitting in a converted shed behind my sister's old house, a shed that smells of cedar and earth and keeps me company in its silence. But once I had a whole household under my command. Once I was the woman who cooked for 20 people every Easter, who ironed 3 shirts a day, who remembered the birthdays of every niece and neighbor. Now I am reduced to these words on a door, words that turned me into a shadow before I had even left the room. It was not sudden, though I suppose from the outside it might look that way. Decline never is sudden. It is a slow disassembling of your place at the table, an incremental stealing of space until you are sitting on the edge of your own life and trying not to disturb anyone with your presence. They didn't mean to be cruel at first, or so I told myself in the beginning. My daughter-in-law, efficient and polished, spoke of the laundry room as if it were a gift, saying it was close to the kitchen, cozy, private. And my son, with the tired voice of a man always pulled in too many directions, nodded along, promising me I would be more comfortable there than upstairs, where the children ran and the stairs might tire me. I agreed because mothers always agree, because we learn to swallow the discomfort and shape it into gratitude so as not to burden those we birthed. I packed my things, folded my sweaters into a smaller suitcase than the life I had lived, and told myself the laundry room would be fine, that it was temporary, that at least I was still with them. But once the door closed, once the machine smell settled into the air and the light came only through a small barred window, I understood it wasn't a room prepared for me. It was a corner prepared for storage, and I had been placed there like a box, too large to throw away, but too useless to keep in sight. The night I first heard them laughing was the night I knew. It carried through the vents, careless laughter about when the space opens up and what we'll do after she's gone. They didn't say my name, but they didn't need to. I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling that still bore the faint outline of detergent bottles once stacked high, and I felt my body stiffen not from fear, but from the recognition of truth. I was already gone to them, already erased, and the lipstick letters on the door only made visible what had long been settled in their minds. The grandchildren weren't cruel. They were too young and too absorbed in their devices, their whispers, their private worlds. They avoided my door not because they feared me, but because they had learned from their parents that what lay behind it was irrelevant. Children are always quick to learn irrelevance. It is handed to them like a game. I think often of the irony that in this family, the house itself carried my name first. My husband and I bought it when we were both still working. Our signatures pressed side by side on the deed, and it was me who made the first payments when money was tight. Me who refused vacations so that we could hold on to the mortgage. Me who sewed curtains and planted roses in the yard to turn 4 walls into a home. My son was 5 when he first ran across those floors. My daughter-in-law had not even been born, and yet now I was the intruder, a tolerated figure, a ghost who disturbed the carefully curated decor. The house smelled of new paint and scented candles, the kind of perfection that leaves no room for memory. My photographs disappeared one by one. My chair in the living room was given away. My casserole dish replaced with gleaming stainless steel. I asked once, softly, where the photographs had gone, and my daughter-in-law replied with a smile too bright. "We're trying a new aesthetic. Cleaner, fresher." I nodded, because what else was I to do? Remind her that the faces in those photographs were the reason she had a family at all? So when I saw the word dead on my door, I did not gasp or cry. I simply acknowledged it as the truth finally spelled out. It was not meant for the children. They couldn't spell it with such certainty. It was meant for me. A reminder, a message, a cruel little prophecy. And still, I sat on the bed, my legs aching, and thought about the years when the only words written on doors in this house were, "Welcome home," or "Happy birthday." I thought about the notes my husband used to leave for me on the fridge, little jokes about milk running out or invitations to walk with him after supper. He has been gone nearly 2 decades, and yet, in that moment, I could almost hear his laugh, the laugh that would have shaken his head at the absurdity of children forgetting the hand that raised them. I want to tell you that I felt anger, righteous fury that propelled me immediately into action, but that would be a lie. What I felt was something slower, heavier. Confirmation. Confirmation that the small humiliations I had endured were not accidental but deliberate, that my shrinking role was not my imagination, but their plan. Meals left cold on the counter, outings arranged without telling me, the way conversations would pause when I entered a room, the way they spoke of me as if I were already an object. "She's tired. She won't mind. She doesn't need much." Always in the third person, as though speaking about a chair too old to repair. I lived in that house, but I was not of it anymore. I was already placed outside of their world, and the lipstick letters were only the graffiti of truth. And yet here I am, still breathing, still writing, still remembering. They wrote "dead," but when I pressed my hand against the door, I felt the warmth of my own skin and realized that as long as I could feel that warmth, I was not done. The insult, the humiliation, the quiet cruelty, they had chipped at me, but they had not hollowed me out. I am not a ghost, not yet, and if they wanted me to vanish, they would have to watch me leave alive. That is the thought that carried me through the following days, through the whispers and the dismissals, through the silence that spread like mold in every corner of that house. I began to hold on to it like a secret weapon. They had written me off, and so now I was free to decide what came next. They had already buried me. All I had to do was dig myself out. The morning after I discovered that hateful word on my door, I sat in the laundry room turned bedroom, with the curtains drawn, and listened carefully to the sounds of the house. Because when cruelty comes quietly, you have to train your ears to catch its rhythm, and that day the rhythm changed. I heard the clinking of cups, the low voices of my son and his wife speaking in the kitchen, their words muffled but not enough to hide the edges of meaning. They thought I was asleep, or perhaps they knew I could hear and simply no longer cared, but I caught fragments like sharp glass. Inheritance? Sooner or later. The room upstairs will finally be free. And a chilling sentence uttered by my son in a tone of weary practicality. She's more shadow than person these days. It was not said in anger, not with a raised voice, but with the quiet efficiency of someone discussing the removal of clutter, and that is when the truth lodged itself inside. Me. I was not only inconvenient, I was being erased by design. Later that day, I walked down the hallway slowly, each step heavy with a deliberate dignity, and I opened the refrigerator looking for something to eat. On the second shelf, I saw the plate that had been mine the night before, still covered with foil, the food congealed and cold, placed there not to nourish me, but to keep me out of sight during dinner. They had eaten together, my son and his wife and their children, and I had sat waiting in my small room, thinking perhaps they had forgotten to call me, but in truth, they had not wanted me at the table. I peeled back the foil, stared at the gray meat, and suddenly I felt as if the word on the door had bled into the plate, that everything around me was insisting on my disappearance. I set the food back, untouched, and made myself tea instead, because sometimes the smallest refusal is the only way to keep hold of your own life. It was that evening, while I sat quietly with my cup cooling in my hand, that the catalyst came in its sharpest form. My granddaughter, only 11, came to the door of my room, her face pale with confusion. She whispered that she hadn't meant to see, that she was only looking for her tablet charger, but she had overheard her mother telling a neighbor that I might need professional care soon, somewhere safer, more contained. I thanked the child, stroked her hair, and told her she mustn't worry, but inside I felt the earth shift beneath me. Safer, more contained, were words that did not mean help. They meant disposal. They meant being placed out of sight in a facility, a place where inconvenient elders go to shrink and fade. And I knew then that if I did not act, if I did not carve out a place for myself, I would one day be driven in silence to a building with locked doors and pastel walls, and that would be the end of me long before the grave. That night I could not sleep. I lay on the narrow bed with the thin blanket pulled up to my chin, and I stared at the ceiling that smelled of detergent, and I remembered the first time I brought my son home from the hospital, the way I had held him against my chest and promised him with all the unspoken fierceness of a young mother that I would protect him from all harm, that I would never let him feel unwanted, never let him feel like a burden. I had worked shifts I could barely endure. I had sold pieces of jewelry. I had mended clothes until my fingers were raw, all so he could grow up with comfort, with safety, with dignity. And now that same boy, gray around the temples, father of children himself, sat in the kitchen whispering about when I might vacate the space he wanted. The betrayal was not just personal. It was ancestral. It was a breaking of the chain of love that mothers hand down through sacrifice. The true blow, however, came the following morning when I walked into the hallway to find that the word had not been cleaned from the door. No one had tried to wipe it. No one had covered it with paint or even tape. They had walked past it, all of them, my son, his wife, even the children, and not one had thought it necessary to erase the violence. It remained there, glaring and obscene, not as a prank or a mistake, but as a declaration. And I realized with a clarity that shook me that the house itself had turned against me. For the first time, I understood that if I stayed, if I continued to accept the cold meals and the silence and the gradual removal of everything that marked me as a person, one day I would indeed be dead in truth, and no one would notice until they needed the room. So the catalyst was not just the word, not just the overheard conversations, not even the cold food in the refrigerator. It was the accumulation of all those details pressing against me until I could no longer breathe in that space, until the air itself felt borrowed. It was the sense that I had been moved from mother to guest, from guest to burden, from burden to corpse, all without anyone saying it aloud. I knew then that I could not wait for kindness, could not hope for recognition. The house that I had built with my labor had become a mausoleum, and if I did not leave it, I would be buried inside it while still breathing. The catalyst was the moment I stopped telling myself stories to soften the cruelty and finally admitted what was happening. I was being erased, and the only way to remain alive was to refuse their script. After the first shock of seeing those letters and hearing their whispers wore into something duller, I tried to convince myself that I could still remain quiet and endure, that the storm might pass if I simply kept my head lowered. But what came instead was a slow erosion, the kind that eats at you grain by grain until one day you realize you have been hollowed out. They did not shout. They did not slam doors. There were no dramatic arguments that anyone could point to as proof of cruelty. Instead, there were endless small adjustments that narrowed my existence. The first was the chair in the living room, an old armchair upholstered in faded blue fabric, the one I had claimed as my reading chair for decades, the one where I had rocked my son when he was feverish, where I had sat with my husband on winter, nights where I had mended countless hems. One morning, I walked into the living room, and the chair was gone. In its place stood a sleek new lamp, metallic and sterile, which my daughter-in-law proudly explained was part of her effort to modernize the space. She said it brightly, as if expecting thanks for improving the view, but I felt the absence of that chair like the pulling of a tooth without anesthetic. When I asked where it had gone, she shrugged and said it had been donated, because it didn't fit the aesthetic anymore. She said aesthetic as though comfort were irrelevant, as though history were a stain to be scrubbed away, and I stood there with my hands trembling, realizing that I had been erased along with the chair, because it was never about fabric or color. It was about removing the last visible trace of me from the common space. It continued quietly, each day another piece taken from me. The framed photograph of my husband and me on our 25th anniversary disappeared from the mantel, replaced by a designer vase that looked like something meant for a showroom rather than a home. When I asked about it, my son avoided my eyes and muttered that the frame had been scratched and was in storage somewhere. In storage, like me, like the pieces of me they could not throw away outright, but could tuck out of sight where they would not interfere with their curated life. My casserole dish, the heavy glass one I had carried to every potluck and family dinner for 40 years, was quietly given to charity. And when I noticed its absence and asked about it, my daughter-in-law laughed softly and said, "Oh, we never use it. It's too old-fashioned." My clothes, too, became subject to commentary, gentle but cutting. Suggestions that certain sweaters made me look tired, hints that perhaps I should wear more beige to blend in, offers of scarves in muted tones that felt like shrouds. The refrigerator became a place of quiet punishment. Meals for the family were vibrant, steaming, served at the table with chatter and clinking glasses, while mine were always cold plates wrapped in foil, waiting for me after the dishes had been cleared. At first I told myself it was oversight, that they forgot to call me, but patterns reveal truth. It was never forgetfulness, it was exclusion disguised as convenience. "We thought you might want to eat later," they would say, or "we didn't want to disturb you," but the reality was that they did not want me there. The kitchen table had once been the center of my life, the place where homework was done, where arguments were soothed, where birthdays were celebrated, and now it was a stage where I had no part. I would sit alone in my small room, eating food that had lost all warmth, while the sounds of their laughter echoed faintly through the vents, and the loneliness of that ritual was heavier than hunger itself. Even my access to the house was diminished. One evening, I came back from a short walk around the block, my knees aching, but my spirit desperate for air. And when I reached for the key to let myself in, I found that my old copy no longer fit the lock. They had changed it without telling me. When I knocked, my daughter-in-law opened the door with exaggerated surprise, exclaiming that she had forgotten to give me the new key, that it was only a precaution for safety reasons. Safety, always safety, that word twisted into a justification. For control, they gave me the new key, but the message was clear. The house was not mine. Entry was conditional. I was a guest who required permission. The insult settled deep into my bones because the deed still bore my name, and yet the key in my hand told me otherwise. Conversations began to tilt in tone as well. At family gatherings, they spoke around me rather than to me, referring to me in the third person as though I were not sitting there. She's resting more these days. She gets confused about the schedule. She doesn't need to worry about this. Always she, never you, as though I had already slipped into absence, as though my voice were unnecessary in matters concerning my own life. When I tried to contribute, my words were brushed aside with polite smiles, the way one humors a child's interruption. I learned to stop trying, but the silence was its own humiliation, because it confirmed that my existence was tolerated, but not valued. The cruelties were not dramatic, but they were relentless. The laundry room where I slept grew colder as autumn crept in, yet no one thought to offer an extra blanket or ask if I was warm enough. The small barred window stayed shut, and I sometimes stood on my toes to see a sliver of sky, as though I were imprisoned. My books, once displayed proudly in the living room, were boxed up and stacked in a closet to create more space. When I asked for one, I had to wait until someone had time to dig it out, as if requesting my own belongings was an inconvenience. My medication, which I had always managed myself, began appearing in a weekly pill organizer placed on the kitchen counter, filled by my daughter-in-law with the briskness of a nurse checking off a chore, though I had never asked for her help. It was presented as kindness, but it was control, a reminder that even my body was no longer trusted to me. The isolation grew insidious. Invitations to outings dwindled until they vanished altogether. Birthdays passed with no cake for me, no acknowledgement beyond a passing, "Happy birthday, Mom," uttered without looking up from a phone. Holidays, once a time when I was central, when my recipes and decorations set the tone, became orchestrated affairs managed entirely by my daughter-in-law, with no space for my input. When I offered to bake, she smiled tightly and said everything was already ordered. Less stress for you. Less stress meant less presence, less involvement, less me. I became a shadow in my own lineage, watching from the edges as life carried on without me. Perhaps the worst was the way the grandchildren began to mirror their parents. At first they were affectionate, running into my room with questions, with little drawings to show me. But slowly that faded. They grew hesitant, avoiding eye contact, mumbling greetings before slipping away. I realized that they were learning from the adults how to treat me, as someone fading, someone irrelevant, someone already dead. Children are never cruel by nature, but they are quick to imitate, and their avoidance was like a mirror reflecting back the truth I could not ignore. This was the first escalation. Not a single act, but a steady accumulation, a deliberate quieting of my existence until I barely made a ripple in the house I had once ruled. Each day brought a new absence, a chair, a photograph, a place at the table, a key, a voice. Each loss was small enough to dismiss if taken alone, but together they formed a pattern as undeniable as the lipstick letters on my door. I began to understand that they were not waiting for me to die. They were rehearsing it, practicing my absence until it felt natural, until the day it would be real would not require adjustment. I was being trained out of life, and the realization filled me not with rage but with a cold clarity. If I stayed, I would vanish by inches, and no one would notice until the space I left was already filled with something newer, cleaner, more aesthetic. It is strange how the smallest objects, forgotten in corners and attics, can hold the power to change the direction of a life. For weeks I had lived under the weight of silence and slow erasure, convincing myself that resistance was futile, that at my age it was easier to comply, to accept what was being taken from me in pieces. And yet, one rainy afternoon, while I was left alone in the house, I climbed the narrow steps to the attic, something I had not done in years, and there, among boxes of Christmas ornaments and discarded toys, I found the old lockbox I had once hidden there for safekeeping. I had nearly forgotten it, though not entirely, because even in the fog of humiliation and diminishing space, there are corners of the mind that cling to the knowledge of what remains ours. The lockbox was dusty, its paint chipped, the key taped to the bottom with yellowing cellophane. But my hands remembered it at once. I carried it down the stairs, my knees trembling from the effort, and when I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened it, the sound of the latch releasing felt louder than thunder. Inside lay the pieces of my life that no one else remembered, because no one cared to remember. There were old savings bonds in my name, nearly forgotten but still valid. Small investments I had made quietly during the years when every dollar mattered. Folded documents that bore my name at the top. My name, not his, not theirs. And property deeds that tied me to more than the house where I was now imprisoned. There was my birth certificate, my Social Security card, and an envelope of letters I had written but never sent to my husband after his death, notes that reminded me of who I had once been when I was still seen and loved. I spread them out carefully across the bedspread, like relics in a museum. And for the first time in years, I felt the undeniable weight of proof that I still existed, not just as a burden in someone else's household, but as a legal, tangible person with rights and assets and history. My daughter-in-law might curate away my photographs and lock me out of the front door, but she could not erase my name from these papers. They were mine, and holding them filled me with a strange, almost giddy strength, the kind of strength I had forgotten I was capable of feeling. That night, I could not sleep. Not because of despair, but because my mind was awake with possibilities. If I could still prove myself on paper, then perhaps I could still prove myself in life. I thought of the library, a place I had not visited in years, and the next morning, instead of waiting meekly for another cold plate of food, I put on my coat, tucked the documents into my handbag, and walked slowly, painfully, but deliberately down the street to the building of stone and glass that had once been my sanctuary. It smelled the same, faintly of dust and ink and whispered lives, and when I stepped inside, I felt a ripple of recognition, as though the building itself remembered me. At the desk sat a woman about my age, her hair silver, her glasses perched low, and when she saw me fumbling with my papers, she smiled not with pity, but with curiosity. We began to talk, cautiously at first, and it turned out she had once been an attorney before retirement, someone who knew the language of rights and signatures. She glanced at the bonds, the deeds, the certificates, and though she did not intrude, she said softly, "You still have more power than you think." The words sank into me like rain into dry soil, reviving something long dormant. I left the library that day with more than just books. I left with the beginning of a plan. It was not yet clear, not yet sharp, but the fog that had dulled me for months began to lift. I stopped at a small shop and bought a notebook with a plain brown cover and a fountain pen that felt heavy in my hand. And when I returned to the laundry room that evening, I sat at the narrow desk and wrote on the first page in large, uneven letters, "I am not dead." The act of writing it, of seeing those words in my own hand, was like striking a match in darkness. I kept writing, not long paragraphs, just small declarations. This is my life. I choose what happens next. I remember who I am. Each sentence was a stone placed back into the foundation of myself, and though no one else could hear them, I read them aloud in a whisper, as though teaching myself a language I had nearly forgotten. The days that followed began to shift subtly. I still accepted the cold meals and the silence, but now I carried my notebook like armor. When they spoke about me as if I were not present, I wrote down the words they used: tired, confused, burden, and then I crossed them out with deliberate strokes, replacing them with words of my own choosing: strong, clear, alive. It was not rebellion in the obvious sense. It was rebellion in the private chambers of the soul, and it gave me the steadiness to begin imagining more. I started taking walks beyond the block, further than before, into neighborhoods where no one knew me as a shadow. On one of those walks, I discovered a community bulletin board outside a grocery store, cluttered with flyers for babysitters, dog walkers, and rooms for rent. My eyes lingered on one handwritten note in bold block letters: room available for quiet tenant, no drama, safe house, cash weekly. My heart beat harder as I read it, because it was the first time in months that the word room did not mean confinement, but possibility. I copied the number into my notebook, not yet daring to call, but knowing I would. The shift was not loud, not a sudden explosion of independence, but it was steady, undeniable. I no longer believed their script. I no longer accepted the lie that I was fading. I had proof in my documents, in my notebook, in the rhythm of my steps on new streets. I began to understand that I was not waiting for death, but waiting for myself to awaken, and that awakening had begun. The quiet defiance that had begun with the rediscovery of my documents and the purchase of that plain brown notebook carried me like a small, hidden flame. But flames, when noticed, always invite attempts to snuff them out, and it was not long before. The pressure returned heavier, sharper, and more deliberate than before. The first sign came in the form of an envelope slipped into the mail one gray morning, an official-looking notice that bore my name but had been opened already. The crease rough, the flap torn not by my careful hand, but by someone else's. Inside was a form concerning the property I had once co-owned, something dense with legal language about transfers and adjustments, and though I could not decipher all of it, I saw enough to understand that my son was quietly maneuvering to erase my name from what remained. I carried the paper to my room, sat on the bed with my documents spread out before me, and traced the letters of my own name as if to remind myself that they still belonged to me. The betrayal was not only in the act itself, but in the secrecy, the assumption that I was too feeble or confused to notice what was being done in my name. It was theft dressed up as responsibility, and the knowledge that he had taken the time to open my mail, to breach even that last small privacy, cut more deeply than any word spoken aloud. From that day, the atmosphere in the house thickened, as though they had sensed my awareness and moved to close ranks. My daughter-in-law's voice sharpened into a tone that was both falsely sweet and unmistakably cold. She began to suggest, in the presence of neighbors and even the children, that I was forgetting things, that I misplaced objects, that I repeated myself, tiny insinuations that built a narrative of decline. When the television remote was missing from the living room, she sighed dramatically and said, "She probably carried it away without realizing." When a bill was paid late, though she herself handled all the accounts, she remarked to her husband, within my hearing, that "Mom is slipping. We really need to think about what's best." Each comment was small, easy to dismiss if taken alone, but together they formed a chorus designed to convince everyone, including me, that I was losing grip on reality. I knew the tactic. It was gaslighting softened by domestic politeness, a rewriting of my competence into frailty. And it terrified me not because it was true, but because I understood how convincing such a narrative could become if repeated often. Enough. The cruelty grew bolder. One evening, I discovered a bundle of torn envelopes in the trash, the kind that bore the handwriting of my oldest friend, a woman with whom I had exchanged letters for decades. She lived states away, and though she could no longer visit, she wrote faithfully every month, filling pages with her thoughts and her prayers. I had wondered why the letters had stopped coming, had felt the absence like a small death. But now here they were, ripped into pieces, discarded before I could even see them. I pieced one together on my lap, Scotch taping the fragments until the words became legible again, and when I read her warm greetings, her inquiry after my health, her story about her granddaughter's wedding, I wept not only for the loss of her company, but for the deliberate cruelty of those who had hidden it from me. They had cut me off from the outside world not by force, but by theft, stealing the small lifelines that might have reminded me I was still loved beyond the walls of this house. Then came the padlock. It was presented as a kindness, of course, as all punishments are when dressed in family language. One night, after a long day of whispers and sidelong glances, I returned to my room to find a shiny new lock installed on the outside of the door. My son explained it in a halting voice, insisting it was for my own safety, that sometimes elderly people wander at night, that the lock was to keep me secure. Secure. What a word, heavy with hypocrisy. Secure not to protect me, but to contain me, to prevent me from disturbing their curated peace, to make sure that when the house went quiet at night, I was as silent and still as the storage boxes in the attic. They did not turn the key, not yet, but the threat was implicit. If they decided I was too much trouble, they had the means to shut me in. That night, I sat on the bed staring at the gleam of the metal in the dim light and realized that the shift I had begun was not enough. Resistance scribbled in a notebook was not enough. Quiet walks to the library were not enough. They were escalating, and so must I. The children began avoiding me entirely, their eyes sliding past me as though I were invisible. At meals, when I did occasionally manage to sit with them, my words landed in silence, Once, when I asked my grandson about school, he looked at his mother before answering, as though he required permission even to acknowledge me. I realized then that their image of me had been deliberately poisoned, that I was being painted in their minds as something frightening, unstable, embarrassing. My own grandchildren were being taught to fear me, not through shouted warnings, but through a steady diet of sighs, rolled eyes, and muttered complaints. To them, I was no longer Grandma who baked cookies, who told stories, who bandaged scraped knees. I was the strange old woman behind the door marked dead, a figure they were better off avoiding. The cruelty of it was almost elegant in its efficiency. By the time I was gone, there would be no grief, only relief, because I had already been written out of their affections. There was one evening when the full weight of their campaign nearly crushed me. I overheard my daughter-in-law speaking on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low but insistent, saying she was researching facilities, that it was time to start making arrangements before things became unmanageable. She spoke of me as though I were a piece of furniture too worn to repair, as though I were not standing only a few feet away, my hands trembling as I clutched the doorframe. Her words were filled with false concern, phrases like, "for her own good," and "we can't handle this forever." But the truth beneath them was naked. They wanted me gone. The facility was not a question of care, but of disposal, a way to clear the space without guilt. That night, I sat awake until dawn, staring at my notebook, reading the words I had written over and over, "I am not dead," until the letters blurred, and I swore to myself that if they locked me away in some institution, it would not be because I went. Quietly, the second escalation was not a single blow, but a siege, an organized effort to suffocate me into submission, and in its midst I found myself tested in ways I had not expected. There were moments of weakness, nights when I thought perhaps it would be easier to give in, to let them ship me off and surrender what remained of my dignity. But each time that thought crept in, I forced myself to remember the documents in my lockbox, the bonds in my name, the deed that still bore my signature, the letters from my friend that had been stolen from me. Those were proofs, undeniable and tangible, that I was still someone, still alive, still capable of choice. And with each insult, each manipulation, each theft of my presence, the flame within me grew hotter. They wanted me silent, but silence had become unbearable. They wanted me compliant, but compliance had become death. I began to plan, not in whispers, but in clear sentences written across the pages of my notebook. Find a lawyer. Call the number on the flyer. Prepare to leave. The cruelty reached its peak one Sunday afternoon, when my daughter-in-law, in front of her friends gathered in the living room, referred to me not as her husband's mother, not even by name, but simply as the old one in the back. They laughed lightly, not cruelly, not knowingly, just the polite laughter of people who take their cues from the hostess. But I felt the floor tilt beneath me, because in that moment I understood that the erasure was complete. In her story, I was not even family anymore, only a shadow tucked away in a forgotten room. The lipstick letters on the door had been prophecy, and she had fulfilled them with her words. Yet even as my chest burned with humiliation, I felt a strange calm descend. If I was dead to them, then I was free to live elsewhere. If I was erased in this house, then I could choose to appear in another. Their escalation, their cruelty, their theft of my dignity had not ended me. It had awakened me. And so I began to plot, not survival, but escape. Not endurance, but liberation. The siege had backfired, and though they did not yet know it, The woman they had tried to bury was already digging her way out, one steady stroke at a time. The night I finally acted was not marked by thunder or drama. No one screamed. No one begged me to stay. It was quiet, almost eerily ordinary. And perhaps that was what gave me the courage. I had been preparing for weeks, carrying documents in my handbag, memorizing bus routes, gathering strength from the sentences in my notebook until they felt carved into my bones rather than written on paper. Still, when the moment came, it felt like stepping through a thin veil between the woman I had been forced to become and the woman I was determined to reclaim. It was 3 a.m, the house silent, my son and his wife asleep behind their closed door, the children breathing softly upstairs. And I sat on the edge of my narrow bed with my shoes already laced, my coat folded neatly on my lap, my handbag heavy with papers and determination. The lipstick letters on my door had faded by then, but the memory of them glowed like embers in my mind, and I whispered to myself one last time, I am not dead. I opened the door carefully, the old hinges groaning slightly, and walked down the hallway that had once been mine, my footsteps echoing on floors I had polished for decades. I paused outside their bedroom door, the door of my son and his wife, and for a moment I almost faltered. On the small table beside it sat the shiny new padlock they had placed on mine, as if mocking me even in their sleep. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and then, with a steadiness that surprised me, I slipped it onto their door latch and turned the key. The click was soft, but to me it thundered louder than any victory. It was not malice, it was not vengeance. It was a gesture of truth, a reversal of roles, a symbolic act that told me I was still capable of choice. They had sought to lock me away, to contain me like a dangerous animal, but in the end, it was they who woke to the sound of their own imprisonment. I left a note in the kitchen, not long, not cruel, just a few words written in the same hand that had filled countless permission slips and grocery lists. Dead things don't walk. I placed it under the cold plate that had been left for me the night before, an offering returned with clarity. Then I opened the front door with my own key, the new one they had begrudgingly given me, and stepped out into the crisp night air. The stars above were sharp and clear, the street empty, the silence vast but filled with possibility. My breath fogged in the cold, and for the first time in years it felt like proof, a visible sign that I was still alive. I walked slowly at first, my legs stiff, but with each step I felt lighter, as though I were shedding the years of humiliation that had been draped across my shoulders like chains. At dawn, I arrived at the small office of a notary, a place I had discovered during my walks, and though the clerk looked startled to see an old woman arrive so early, I stood straighter than I had in years as I spread my documents across the desk. My hands shook, but my voice did not as I declared my intent to sever ties to the house, to transfer what remained of my financial standing into my own name alone, to reclaim what had always been mine. Each signature I placed was like striking another chain from my body, each stamp an affirmation that I was still present in the eyes of the law, if not in the hearts of my family. I arranged to have my mail forwarded, my account secured, my bonds transferred, and when it was done, I sat with the notary as she slid the papers back into my folder and said with quiet respect, "You're stronger than most." I smiled, not with pride, but with relief, because at last someone had spoken words that recognized my existence rather than denied it. I did not stop there. Before I left, I walked to the post office and placed a small change of address card into the slot. One more act of quiet defiance. I watched it disappear into the metal box and felt as though I had dropped a stone into water, the ripples spreading outward beyond the reach of my son or his wife. I knew that when they tried to intercept my checks, when they sought to open my mail, they would find only absence. The same absence they had cultivated in me for years now returned to them. They had already buried me, and yet it was I who had written the final line of the story. I was gone, not dead, but free. By midday, I had found myself at the address scrawled on the flyer I had copied from the grocery store bulletin board. It was a modest building, nothing grand, nothing that would impress anyone who cared about aesthetics. But when the woman who owned it opened the door, she looked me in the eye without flinching, without looking past me as though I were invisible. She asked no prying questions, only whether I wanted tea, and when I nodded, she led me to a room at the back of the house with a small window that overlooked a garden. The rent was reasonable, the space humble, but to me it was a palace, because it was mine. I placed my handbag on the bed, opened the window, and breathed in air that smelled of earth and possibility rather than detergent and secrecy. The climax was not fire or shouting or dramatic confrontation. It was the quiet dignity of taking back what had been stolen from me, the act of walking away with my own 2 feet rather than waiting to be carried out. It was the padlock on their door, the signatures on the papers, the note under the plate, the forwarding of my name to a new address. It was irreversible, a series of choices that could not be undone. And though I had no illusions that my absence would wound them, I knew it would unsettle them, because the woman they thought was too frail, too broken, too dead to resist, had left them behind, alive and undeniable. And as I sat on the bed in that new room, sunlight warming my face, I whispered once more the words that had carried me here. I am not dead. This time, I did not need to write them down. In the weeks that followed, the silence of my new room felt nothing like the silence of the laundry cell I had left behind. This silence was not the suffocation of being ignored, but the calm of space that belonged to me. And as I adjusted to the rhythm of life without their footsteps above my head or their voices whispering judgments in the kitchen, I discovered that peace does not need grandeur. It only needs honesty. The room was small, the walls plain, the furniture second-hand, but the window opened wide to the garden, and every morning I watched light pour across the soil, as if to remind me that life does not end until it ends. I planted herbs in a pot, watered them daily, and when the first shoots of green broke through the soil, I felt a tenderness that I had not allowed myself in years, because tending something small and alive reminded me that I, too, was still growing. I found companionship among the women who lived in the house, a strange collection of souls, some widows like me, others divorced, others simply too tired of being unseen in families that no longer needed them. We shared meals around a modest table, nothing fancy, nothing rehearsed, just food cooked with hands that had fed children, husbands, parents, and now, at last, ourselves. There was laughter, low and genuine, and stories that did not need to be polished, because here no one measured worth by youth or usefulness. One of the women suggested we start a letter-writing circle, a way of keeping our voices alive beyond these walls, and I joined without hesitation. On the first page of my new notebook, I wrote not only for myself, but for someone unknown, a woman I imagined sitting in a room like mine, waiting for a sign that she was not alone. I wrote, "You don't have to wait for permission. They already buried you. Dig yourself out." When I sealed the envelope, I felt as though I had released a lifeline into the world, one that might land in hands desperate for it. Of course, there were moments of grief, because leaving did not erase the years of devotion that had led me into that house, nor the love I once believed unbreakable between mother and son. Some nights I lay awake, remembering his small boy's hand gripping mine, the warmth of his forehead against my shoulder, and the promises I had whispered to protect him always. The betrayal still cut deep, and I knew it might never fully heal, but I also understood that forgiveness was no longer my duty. I had carried enough weight, bent enough times under the burden of excusing others, and now I allowed myself to set that burden down. I did not hate them. Hate requires energy I no longer wish to waste. I simply let them drift into the distance of my life, like figures on a shore I had sailed away from. The greatest gift of my escape was not freedom from their cruelty, but freedom from the fear that had bound me to it. For so long I had believed I had no choice, that at my age obedience was survival. But when I walked out that door, I proved to myself that choice does not vanish with age. It only hides, waiting for us to be brave enough to claim it again. Now, each morning when I tape a new note to my own door, sometimes as simple as alive or still here or breathing, I remind myself that visibility is not given. It is taken. My room is not large, but it is mine. And in that ownership, I find more dignity than in any inheritance or family photograph. One afternoon, as I watered my herbs, a letter arrived. It was from my youngest grandson, written in uneven handwriting, saying simply, "Grandma, I found the key you left. Can I come see you?" I read it over and over, the words trembling in my hands, because within them lay both risk and hope. Perhaps he would be allowed, perhaps not. Perhaps the poison had not fully taken root in him. I do not know what will come, but I know that if he does appear at my door, he will find me not dead, not diminished, but seated in the sunlight with soil under my fingernails and a pen in my hand. He will find me alive, undeniably, and that is enough. So this is the end of my story, not in the sense of finality, but in the sense of arrival. I do not know how many years remain, but I know that they belong to me, and that knowledge is a kind of resurrection. To any woman who finds herself behind a door marked with cruelty, I say this: you may believe you are finished, that you have no strength left, but strength is not always a roar. Sometimes it is the quiet turning of a key, the slow walk into the night, the act of claiming air that others told you was no longer yours. They may write you dead, but the ink is powerless if you keep walking. And when you do, the world, vast and imperfect as it is, will still greet you with sky, with soil, with possibility. And you will discover, as I did, that the truest revenge is simply to live, fully and without apology, until the very last breath.